Can you tell me a little bit more about yourself and your background and what you do?
Hi, absolutely. Thank you for having me. My name is Jen Lee. I am creator and host of I Need Blue podcast, Survivors Talk Surviving. A decade ago, I became a survivor of a grouped armed robbery and abduction. So, with that experience, I decided I would start a podcast as a way for other survivors of trauma to share their story. I work with local, national, international organizations to create awareness and provide resources. And that's my podcast.
Yes, and it's a very good podcast, by the way. I did listen to a few episodes, and I don't know, it's just amazing. All of the stories from trauma survivors. It's great. I mean, yeah, I love all the work that you're doing for sure. And so, what I know you've said you went through your own experience, but what got you inspired to start the work that you're doing?
So a couple of things is number one, my podcast is called I Need Blue. I was asked, Jen, how did you all escape during the abduction, right? And I said, we didn't. We were rescued by law enforcement, hence the name I Need Blue. So we give thanks to law enforcement, but honestly, all of our first responders, and you've seen my podcast, so you know I have 911 dispatchers,
Mhm.
everything. Um, I started to kind of watch what was going on TV within our great country, and I realized that I had another side of the story to share that I felt was really important. And if I was going to share my thoughts, I needed to have it be backed up by a real life situation, not just my opinion. That was really important to me. And so I really had never talked about the robbery in the detail that I do now. I just never did, but I felt it was time. And the funny thing is, I'll never forget the day that my neighbor and I were joking around about because we're funny. And, he was like, oh, we should do a podcast. I was like, oh, we should be on TV, whatever. Right. But podcast always stuck in my head, and I honestly never listened to podcasts. It's like I don't have the patience for that.
Yeah.
I love to do that, but to get me to sit to listen is a little challenging. But anyway, I'll never forget the day that I walked up to my refrigerator and I was getting ready to open the door, and it was like somebody just slapped me and said, "Okay, you need to do this podcast. Like, you need to help other survivors and also reinforce the need for our law enforcement." And that was April 1st of last year. So I have been starting my podcast. Well, I've been doing my podcast now for a year. May 11th was my actual anniversary date of when I released my first episode. But I, like most podcasters, knew nothing. And so through joining Facebook groups and doing lots of research, I bought my equipment. Excuse me,
Mhm.
and just started to learn things on my own. And so I am self-taught, made my own website, do my own recording, my editing, all of that fun stuff. So I'm telling you, if you're thinking about it, you can do it. Because if I can do it, you can do it. But it has been the most rewarding thing that I have ever done. Forget the fact that all of the technical stuff, right? To be able to share other people's stories. And as you know, we talk about things people don't want to talk about. So we talk
Mhm.
about like child abduction, domestic violence. Uh, I'm in Florida, and we have the third highest rate of human trafficking. So we talk about
Mhm.
that. We talk about drug overdose, but drug recovery. We talk about blue suicide, and it is just amazing. And I am fortunate that I can partner with different organizations, whether it be local, like Serene Harbor, they're a domestic violence shelter here for women, or I work with International Network of Hearts, and Alma down at the border helps with the human trafficking that's going on. So I'm just really thankful that people trust me to share their message, and without them, I would not have a podcast.
Yes, I love that. Well, happy Potiversary, first of all.
I love that. Thank
Yeah,
you.
Potiversary, right? Yeah, my boyfriend's actually in law enforcement, and I kind of also work, I'm a social worker, but I work with our county law enforcement too. I go out with crisis calls and stuff. And so I do hear a lot of these stories, with law enforcement, um, ending their lives and things like that. And it's very, I mean, yeah, like it's very like sad and touching. Um, and so yeah, again, like the work that you do is so important. And even like you said, just having someone to share your story with is important. Uh, what do you feel? I mean, I guess what was the importance for you with sharing your story of recovery? And how do you think this is helpful to other people that have been through trauma with just kind of putting themselves out there? Because I know it could be scary, you know? So,
Okay, so you're so right. A couple of things. Number one, thank you to your boyfriend for his service, and thank you for what you do. And I would love to discuss what you do and the type of help that you get based upon the
mhm,
things that you see and have to deal with. But that's like what I'm thinking as you're talking. But to go back to your question, when I first, actually, I remember the first or second time I recorded my story because I said it a few times, I would start to tear up. Like, even though it had been a decade, there were triggers that I hadn't had to deal with it in a while, right? And so number 1 was recognizing that, okay, maybe talking about it isn't as easy as I thought it was gonna be, even though I'm behind a microphone, right?
mhm,
So that was number 1, and number 2 is when other survivors realize they're talking to somebody else who has survived trauma, they realize we all kind of share something.
mhm.
There's something that we all share. And so I think that makes it a little easier for them to open up to me. On top of that, I also am a survivor of a 3-year domestic violence, dating violence relationship as well. So I understand that whole how you get looped into that and you don't even know how it happened. I completely get that as well. But I just, yeah, I'm real. I don't I can show my emotion and I'm encouraging and I'm patient. And I there are times I do a lot of local networking, and there are times that I will meet people, and maybe I've met them 5 times before they will come up to me and say, "Hey, I have a story," or "Would you like to get coffee? I really wanna learn more about you." Or maybe it is they trust me enough now that they just wanna tell somebody their story who they haven't told before. I have done that, and every time I go out isn't to get a podcast guest.
Mhm.
It's just to be a friend, because sometimes we just need somebody to listen. So it's evolved into that as well. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, and that is so true. Like just and I come from like a clinical background, but even then, like, trauma is not like my expertise. And I don't feel like I've ever been through a traumatic situation, thankfully. And so, um, yeah, like just I have had clients and stuff, who have been through traumatic situations. And that is feedback that I have received in the past, is that just having someone to listen, like not necessarily someone to offer any type of advice or, but just having someone listen makes like a really big difference with
Yeah,
recovery.
absolutely. And then I think my guests have gotten to a point where they've talked about it enough and they're like, okay, so now I want to make a difference. Now I want to help. Now I'm ready. It's really all about when you're ready, and you don't have to be ready. You don't ever have to tell your story out loud on a podcast like I
Mhm.
do or my guests. But for them, they're ready, and it's part of their healing process to share the message and really to recognize that you are not alone. You are not alone.
Mhm. So I know you've told your story several times, and like you said, the first times you did it, like it would still kind of make you feel tearful, right? When you would get teary talking about your experience. And so do you feel that now you're at a point where when you talk about it, like it's a different experience for you?
So that's a great question. So if I were to sit here and tell you my whole story, I would be absolutely fine. But I just recently started doing some public speaking. And I was in front of one group of about 50 people, and I already don't like public speaking. But I had to stand up there and tell my story. Like, I didn't have to, I wanted to. And that was the first time I told my whole story from beginning to end, meaning a lot of times I talk about the robbery and then it kind of stops when law enforcement comes and we're rescued and, whatnot. There's so much to the story. But this time I also talked about what it was like after and how I lost my job and how my sense of security was shattered and how I had to drive home different ways because he had my cell phone and my wallet with my current address. He had my life and they never
Mhm.
recovered those pieces of information. So it was the first time that I actually shared my whole story, but in front of people. And felt afterwards like I was emotionally naked.
Mhm.
Because there were times where, like, I would tell my story and I kind of pause because I relive it every time. But it's one thing to relive it, like I said, behind the microphone, and it's another when people can actually see my emotions and they can hear that quiver in my voice um and whatnot. I got home, my husband is like, "Well, how'd it go?" And I said, "Well, I'm really proud of myself because number one, I got up there and I did it for the first time." But I said this other side of me just really wants to just break down and cry. But I said I won't because I don't wanna, like, I wanna hold on to this sense of accomplishment feeling and not let these feelings of wanting to cry, overtake that. But I talked with another lady who was in a similar situation, and she said that she was like, "You know what? I experienced the same thing, and I was given advice to be nice to yourself, be kind, and be gentle to yourself." For me, number one, to know somebody else had felt that same way, because I was trying to figure out if this was normal or like, what is going on with me? But then when she told me to be gentle and kind to myself, I took that to heart. And I was kind and I was gentle and I ate chocolate and asked my husband for a back rub and
That sounds nice.
yeah, I got to be kind to myself, honey.
I know, right?
So
Um,
yeah, that was
yeah, I had the question I was gonna ask you just slipped my mind because I was thinking about a back massage and back rub.
I get it.
Um, and so from traumatic experiences, I know that everyone reacts differently to trauma, and healing is also like not linear, right? Like everyone heals differently. Where, I guess, like, what, where do you usually see, like, because I know you've spoken to a lot of people that have been through trauma and stuff like that, but is there anything in common as far as like when people feel that they're, I don't want to say healed, or like, I don't know, like is there a moment in time where you could actually be healed from trauma, or is it like, what do you think about that?
I think that we carry it with us at all times, but we determine how it's going to affect our lives. And one thing I will say about survivors is they are strong. And the strength just you can hear it in their voice. It's the most amazing thing. There I look at it when I first started my podcast, I was like, "Oh, okay, I'm a victim, I'm a victim." And then I realized, "No, wait a second, Jen, you're not a victim. You are a survivor."
Mhm.
So I think part of the trauma, and again, healing is defined so individually that for me to give an answer, I think would be inaccurate. But there is a transition from when you go from being that victim to survivor, and that is such a huge step, you know, in itself. And again, everybody defines that how they're a survivor based upon their own individual situation. But I think that transition is really important.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, a big takeaway from this is just like the importance of not blaming yourself. Because I feel like a lot of people blame themselves or they'll feel guilty, just depending, everyone's different, but not blaming yourself, being gentle and kind with yourself, taking care of yourself, of course. That's really important. And not necessarily having to talk about the trauma. It's just like whenever you're ready to talk about it, then you could talk about it. Did you ever seek any kind of like therapy or anything like that throughout your process?
Absolutely. I was given 10 days off of work immediately,
Okay.
and they filed a workman claims thing for me. But I did. Within the first week, I went to therapy. The detective and the law enforcement officer, because they had seen me like every day, because I was the go-to person. So I had to be there to help with everything. And they just highly encouraged it. Like, we really think you should go get some help, yada, yada. So I did. And I'm a firm believer in therapy. I was before this. So I think you could go to therapy your whole life and it's not going to hurt you by any means. But I did. I went to therapy and it was helpful, and I had only gone a couple of times, and then my 10 days were up, and I was supposed to go back to work, and my therapist said, "You are not ready." He was like, "I advise you do not go back to work." Well, I'm the type of individual where I can't stop halfway down a road and turn around and then wonder the rest of my life, what if? I have to go to the stop sign. And I felt, because my work was like, "We need you to come back," that it was time for me to figure out if I could, keep going or not, even though my therapist is like, "You're not ready." So I went, and long story short, he was right. I realized that I was not ready. The triggers were absolutely insane. There was a gentleman there who resembled the robber. I did not know he was our security guard, but he resembled a robber instant trigger, and I just about burst into tears. And in that moment I recognized that, I can't do this. At least right now I can't do this. But I ended up losing my job. The conversation was, well, you need to figure out whether you can do this or not, or I need to replace you. And I just said to her on conference call, I said, I can't do it. And so coming to that realization was just another whole layer of trauma associated with being at that time a victim, right? I was a victim, and my actions, some would say, kind of influenced the outcome of 8 other lives, because there was 9 of us total, including children. And fortunately, and I'm so thankful, they relied on me to handle the robber. None of them tried to become a hero or anything like that. You don't know, but losing my job was just, like I said, it was another layer of crap that I had to kind of work through. It was something that wasn't my fault. I didn't ask for it, you know?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like a lot of the times, like we don't realize how much an event can affect us because it's not only affecting a person like mentally, but like you said, it started affecting other areas of your life, your job. And um, did it affect any other areas aside that?
Um, well, definitely, like, personally it did, because, I never figured this out, but for about 3 weeks, I would not go in my bedroom.
Mm.
I would not sleep in there. I would go in there to get some clothes, but otherwise I did not want anything to do with my bedroom, and I don't know why. The only thing, if I had to guess, is that our bedrooms are very intimate. Like, we
Mhm.
feel like we can completely expose ourselves in there, right? That's where we get dressed, and usually the bathroom is attached to a shower, things like that. And I think in some ways I must have felt so violated in a way that I didn't understand, that somehow it translated into my bedroom, where perhaps I always felt 100% safe in my bedroom. And now I no longer felt safe anywhere I
Mhm.
went. And the court system for me was horrendous. I mean, I had a stack of subpoenas
Oh,
about an inch
wow.
high, and it was crazy. And then when I thought it was all over 2 years later, I get called into federal court because he has appealed. And he had been charged with several robberies in different locations. So it ended up in federal court. But that was rough. I thought that I was done dealing with the robbery, and 2 years later, it's like somebody just ripped the Band-Aid right off, and literally every emotion that I had been dealing with that I thought I was past or could now be past, all came back. And federal court's a very different beast from your local court system, the smaller court system, that I've been in front of a jury, and that is, intimidating in itself and whatnot, but it was quite the journey. You know, we look back in life and we say, "Oh my gosh, why did that happen to me?" Right? But I think that unbeknownst to me, it was supposed to lead me to the moment where I am today,
Mhm.
and that's not a bad thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I believe that too. Like everything happens for a reason, right? And we hear that. Um, but interesting to hear, like, just it sounds like it was a long journey. Like, even after the event happened, you have to deal with the courts and you have to go through all of that. And so I feel like a lot of the times that just having to go through all of that is so difficult for people. And, they'd rather just not speak on it, like just keep it to themselves because just having to go through court is just what's the word I'm looking for? Like re-traumatizing, right?
Oh, you're so right. I felt like a victim over and over and
Mhm.
over and over again. And there were so many times I said to myself, I wished I couldn't ID him.
Mm.
I wished I was not able to like be like, yeah, that's him, because then I wouldn't have to be there, right? But then I would stop myself and I would say, Jen, you're here for a reason and you're strong and you're gonna get through this and you're gonna do the right thing, because if you didn't ID him, then he would still be out there robbing people. You know, they found him. He took my cell phone, he took all of our cell phones, but I had a droid and I had Where's My Droid app. And I told the police officer that I had that app, and they pinged it. And they found him, I don't know, 24 hours, I don't know, might have been less, um, about 20 miles north at a bar, living it up.
Oh, wow. So
Yeah.
he was just able to just continue as if nothing had happened, just go to the bar. Wow.
Absolutely, and, I do wish they could have found my wallet and my cell phone, but meh, it's out there somewhere. You know, it's a
Mm.
good thing he kept it, or it had to have somewhere been near him, because otherwise they wouldn't have been able to catch him.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like this was something that he had already been doing for a while to just be able to, go to the bar right after and just be that comfortable, right?
He Yes, a couple months prior, he had done about 12 robberies, but again, they were about 20 miles north. And so there was nothing in my mind that said, okay, he'll travel all the way down to where I was and rob us, right? I mean, because there's a gazillion places along the way he could stop and do the same thing. But he was a prior felon.
Okay.
And so he had gotten out of the state penitentiary. So I think he was just a habitual offender, and perhaps that was his lifestyle, and um and he got caught. So I get the little, I haven't in a while, years, but the little vine, I get emails. So if he gets moved or he gets appeals or whatever, I will get a little email that'll tell me what's going on. But he's, in federal prison. So I'm thankful for that, because the sentence is much longer.
So he's still behind bars.
Yes,
Okay.
he is. Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. And does that, knowing that he's behind bars, um, does that help with, like, help you feel any type different um, now that he's behind bars? Like, does that help you feel more at peace, or how was that with your healing?
I think, I don't think it affects my healing so much, but my sense of safety, it makes me feel safe to know he is there, even though I no longer live by myself. I'm married and, um, one of my episodes, you'll see I got my concealed carry, so I'm more apt to protect myself now than I was certainly back then. But I think just my sense of safety is, um, I have that, but I also know from that experience, not necessarily from him, but from the experience that, you know, anything is possible. And I certainly don't live in paranoia, but I'm aware, I'm aware. So, mhm.
Yeah. With having your podcast and having connected with other people who have gone through their own experiences, have you found any similarities as far as like the way that people experience trauma or the aftermath? Have you found any similarities or anything that stands out, or any patterns?
Yeah, there is, depending upon the nature of the violation,
Mhm.
especially with like childhood abuse and whatnot, there's sexual abuse. There's a lot of guilt and shame that goes along with that. As a domestic violence, dating violence survivor myself, there's a lot of how could blame. How did I not see it? You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
And things like that. Trauma is very individualized, but the guilt and the shame and the I knew better than that, the fear, um, but then also you go through the stages of anger and figuring out how to cope. Everybody copes differently. Sometimes we do it in a healthy manner, sometimes we do it in an unhealthy manner. Being able to recognize those behaviors of when, okay, maybe, drinking 5 beers a night isn't the best thing. But I also find that a lot of people, like friends and family, especially with domestic violence, they don't know what to do. They're like, well, I suspect my sister is being abused, but I just don't know what to do. And so we have conversation about that, um, as well, because trauma, and maybe you've seen this in, your job and you've been to certain cases, but it doesn't just affect the individual. It affects the family, it affects the community. It is not just one person by
Mhm.
any means.
Mhm. Yeah, that's very true. And that's something that a lot of, like, even myself, um when I was first learning about all these things, it's like you don't think about trauma as affecting the family, like you said. Like, it's just a very individual type experience, but you're right, like it can affect the people around the person. And then also, um, traumatic experiences are different for everyone, right? Something that's traumatic to one individual might not be traumatic to another. And I feel like that's important to mention too, because when a lot of people, when they hear the word trauma, they think about like maybe like sexual abuse, or the things we probably see like on TV shows and stuff. But a traumatic experience could be anything that affects the person's emotional, like physical well-being. It could be like a natural disaster. It could be um,
Like
an
war.
accident. Yeah, it could be, war. So there's just so many different situations that can be traumatic to an individual. And so I think that's also important to note, right? And
Yeah. And actually, I have an example I could share with you. I'm so glad you brought that up. So, my next guest, episode 3, actually, Stony. Oh, I love Stony, but I love all my guests. I don't know if you feel like that, but I do. I just love all my guests. But he also was a robbery victim, and trigger warning in here when I talk sometimes. But um, he owned a restaurant and they had been robbed, but he watched two of his employees be executed. And he had been shot in the elbow himself, and his detective friend had been shot in the face point blank. And so he came in and he was just telling his story. He loves law enforcement. So he was like, I'm going to do whatever I can to help you. And I was like, thanks. But I'm watching this gentleman tell his story and I was like, oh my gosh, like why am I upset? Like, he's just had two of his, employees executed. So I learned one thing. Number one is you don't compare your trauma, right?
Mhm.
Your trauma is your trauma. And it's not doesn't mean it's better or worse than anybody else. It is simply your trauma. But number 2, he, uh, he knew a psychiatrist or psychologist, but he didn't seek help. He was like, "I didn't need it." He was like, "I grew up where it was like, you know what? You just brush it off and you move on." So that's what I did. Me, I'm in therapy, right? I'm
Mhm.
driving home different ways. I'm I'm doing all kinds of things, whatever I can. But for him, it was very different. So you are so right. Like trauma, how people deal with it is very much individualized. And just because something worked for me doesn't mean it's going to work for you. I'm always up for suggestions. I'm always up for healthy new ways to learn to deal with whatever because life always throws you curveballs. You don't have to be in some major traumatic situation like me to
Mhm.
have trauma. I mean, you just, trauma is just several different things.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, that was a very good example of like how you said you both had like very similar experiences, but that doesn't mean that you guys had the same, right? Like the same reactions, the same way to process it. Like everyone's very different in that. Everyone has different ways that they cope with difficult situations. So yeah, that was a really good reminder. I'm learning so much from you.
Oh, good.
Yeah, like just all these little things that like, I didn't even think about before. And it's like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
It's okay. You know what I appreciate about you is I've been on other podcasts and I just tell my story, right? But I feel like with you, we're having conversation like about trauma and something that while my story is interesting, right? What you are providing and you're giving your listeners the opportunities to really learn. And I think that that's great. And I like to be able to teach and just share little tidbits of what I've learned along the way. So that's how we help each other, right? So I
Mhm.
appreciate this opportunity. I really do. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Um, okay, so everyone, what we've kind of talked about, like people's reactions to trauma are different, right?
Mhm.
And so some people might experience, I want to say like PTSD like symptoms after a traumatic event. Did you have any of that experience after your your traumatic experience?
Mhm. So actually, I didn't realize I did till maybe 6 months ago, believe it or not, almost a decade later. Well, I had one thing in 2016 when I met my now husband, he was my boyfriend then, he would call me from behind, Jen,
Okay.
whatever. And it would startle me. It would be instant fear turned into anger to where I wanted to turn around and just scream at him like, "Please don't do that. You scared me." Like, he didn't mean to.
Mhm.
So after a few times, I had to explain to him I can't have you call me from behind. Like it's because I wasn't used to his voice or whatever that it just really triggered me and yeah, it was awful what it did. But now I'm over that. He can
Mhm.
call me. I'm good to go. But I grew up around guns. I'm from Michigan. My dad's a hunter. My whole family are hunters, right? Deer hunting and all this other stuff. Didn't bother me. My boys bought them airsoft guns. They're Marines now. So I did not think that I had any type of trauma from a handgun because when I turned around, the robber had a handgun pointed at me, close enough I could touch it, and there was no orange cap indicating that it was a toy, right? So my husband is like, let's go get our concealed carry license. And I said, okay, just because I knew he'd been wanting to do this together for a long time. And finally I was like, okay. But as I got closer, I started to feel this anxiety inside me that was just unfamiliar. I was like, where is this coming from? And then I realized, I was like, okay, so maybe this is coming from the thought of like just touching a gun, you
Mm-hmm.
know? So I called the shooting center where we were set to take lessons, and I told them what I was going through. And they had helped a school shooting survivor kind of overcome the same thing by taking private lessons. So I signed up for that. And I'm going to tell you, that was, I did an episode on it right away. So it was absolutely raw. But when all he did was bring the gun out and set it in front of me, and he would talk to me and tell me what he was going to do. And I just bawled. I just bawled and bawled. And it was insane. I did not know I had all of that inside me. And slowly, then it would be, okay, I want you to touch it. And I would touch it. And I mean, I went for probably about 3 different lessons until I could get to the point where I would go and I would shoot it. But it caught me off guard, and I didn't realize it. And that is the
Mm-hmm.
thing with PTSD. And even 10 years later, things creep up, and it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it doesn't mean I'm weak. It doesn't mean like, oh my God, you have all this work to do now. No, it's just a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. And I accepted it for what it was, and I persevered through. And I can tell you, when we go to the gun range, I recognize that maybe I can stay for no more than a half an hour. And then it's too much for me. It's just too much. That's okay. Like, that is absolutely okay. And I tell my husband, okay, it's time for me to go. Cause otherwise I'll cry. Like, I will just cry. And so we leave. But yeah, PTSD is surprising. And
Mm-hmm.
like, just, you know, it doesn't even tap you on the shoulder and give you a warning. It just like is there in front of your face. And then you're startled, and then you're having to figure out how to deal with it while your heart's pounding and probably wanting to have a panic attack yourself. However your body is reacting to it, you certainly weren't prepared for it.
Yeah.
But the good news is that there are lots of ways now that you can get help for that, and therapy being one of them. But absolutely
Mm-hmm.
learning your triggers, especially with my domestic violence case, learning my
Mm-hmm.
triggers is huge, because then I learn how to cope. You know, you recognize a trigger, accept it for what it is, and then you find ways to deal with it, cope with it in a healthy manner.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. I'm like, yes, I agree with everything you're saying because it can be overwhelming. I know that it's different for everyone too, as far as like things that trigger, certain memories and things like that. So for you, it was just the gun and just like being near it, like just the thought of it, right? And you
Yeah.
kind of went through your own like little exposure therapy. Like that's a thing. So you kind of you went through that. That was like a little exposure therapy. It's just like going for it and just putting yourself in, there with the gun, even if it was like for small periods of time, eventually, but yeah, I love that. And for other, like I've had even clients who certain smells like just trigger memories. So yeah, like it's different for everyone. As far as like the therapy side of it, well actually just like before that, um I feel like we could break down the reactions to like mental, emotional, physical. Like these are all like different types of reactions that people have to traumatic events. Um, and so, like you said, seeking therapy is so important. And I feel like just from my own experiences, um, with helping clients with this, it is important to build your coping skill toolkit early on.
Yes.
Yes, like start, whether it's like deep breathing, meditation, like self-talk, whatever it is, start building up these skills very early on in therapy. Because once you get into the actual like work where you have to go through that exposure therapy, for example, and you start feeling the anxiety and, all of these things come up, like you'll have some tools in your toolkit to use during that time. Um, so that's important, like just building up your toolkit early on, hopefully, in therapy or whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And, the thing is, like, the tool that worked for you might not work for me.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I'm just a huge proponent of therapy. You're absolutely right.
Yes. Okay. Let's see. So, is there anything that you would change, like just going back, thinking about your journey to where you are now? Is there anything that you would do differently or anything you wish you would have known
So,
before all of this?
so you mean before I started my podcast, or throughout my whole life?
I would say after the experience, I guess before the podcast. Yeah.
Oh, so after the robbery? Oh my gosh, I went through a lot of things. um, you know, now that I have my podcast, and in all honesty, if I were to, not to be morbid, but if I were to die tomorrow, I truly feel and believe inside that I have fulfilled my purpose of what I have been put on this earth to do. It is the most amazing feeling that not a lot of people will be able to experience. But because I feel so strongly about that, I wouldn't change anything I've been through because it brought me to where I am today. And I
Mhm.
recognize if I didn't go through those multitude of things, that I might not be as understanding or empathetic or compassionate as I am today.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that does. I think that's what I was trying to get at with my question, but I'm so bad with my words. Is if you would go back and change, your experience, and I completely agree with that, is that, you know, I personally, like I said, haven't been through something that I feel was traumatic to me. But as far as like my own life experiences, like that is something that I've always said too, is that if I could go back, like I wouldn't change anything, like even the negative experiences that I've had, because I feel like it does help shape who you become. Like there's just so much learning from everything. And so, yeah, I agree with that. Like I myself also wouldn't change anything.
Yeah. Well, and I think that we don't fail, we learn is really truly what it is. Is we continue to learn, and through this journey with my podcast and meeting my guests, is it's helped me to understand perhaps maybe why I made some of my decisions in the past, which has been pretty cool, to be like, oh, okay, maybe that's why, I don't, I'm not looking to go to a doctor to get the exact answer, but for me, it made me stop and think. And I like when things make me stop and think, and kind of
Right.
make me, yeah, make me delve inside. And even if that means I have to get a little uncomfortable, it's kind of like when you look at yourself in the mirror, but you really look at yourself in the mirror, not, do my
Yeah.
eyebrows look good? Like, what do you see staring back at you? It's like having one of those moments. And I think every now and then it's a good thing, even though it can be very, very hard.
Mhm. Uh, just going back to your podcast really quick, just with hearing all of the people's stories, and like I'm sure you've made a lot of friends, right? And do you keep in touch with some of your podcast guests, and how is that aftermath, like after hearing their story and
Mhm.
them sharing everything with you?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I feel like I could email any of them and we could just be like, "Hey, how are you?" type thing. Because I have periodically, even if it's just a, "Hey, happy Thanksgiving," or "Merry Christmas," or whatever is going on. I really enjoy maintaining those relationships, but yeah, I do. I have some where, I probably talk to them more than others, just from the connection, but I think because of what I do in my topics, there's already such a level of trust that has to be there for them to wanna open up their story. But I also present my podcast, in such a way where I do explain, like you, it is just audio. My guests do change their names. I couldn't tell you what their real name is or where they're located or anything like that, which is absolutely fine. But I do my own editing, but I also send them the episode before it goes live so they can hear it. And if there's something that, as they hear themselves talk, makes them uncomfortable or like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said that, absolutely, we take it out. It's really about what do I have to do to make my guests comfortable?
Mhm.
And that's my top priority. So they seem to really appreciate that.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really amazing actually, because yeah, you're right. Like when someone is talking about their trauma, right?
Mhm.
And I think even just like them having the opportunity to just play it back and hear themselves talk about it is just like such a powerful tool, even that in itself. Like that's awesome.
Absolutely. I mean, they hear themselves and they're like, wow, I said that. Like, wow, I did that. Wow, I lived through that. Wow, I can talk about it. Wow, I can help people. I can share. I've never had anybody come back honestly and be like, can you please take this out? I've never had anybody want to readjust anything like that. But if anything, they seem to be really pleased and it's them. It's their story. And they'll be like, well, what do you want me to talk about? How long do you want me to talk? And I'm like, this is your story. I was like, I'm not gonna put a time limit on your story, you know? If it's
Yeah.
I can edit out, because I'll be like, I ramble. That's fine, ramble. Some people have to do that to be comfortable. It's just their nature. And I don't want to tell them not to because then they're gonna get really uncomfortable. And
Mhm.
then and that's not good. I don't want my guests to not be comfortable, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, not definitely. And I feel especially if it's a situation where they're talking about it for the first time, right? That's important to just be allowed to speak, like however, whatever they want to say in whichever way. And that did stand out to me when I was listening to your podcast. Is like you were so supportive and you were just like a really great listener as people were telling their stories. You weren't like interrupting, you didn't have like your own like agenda with this. Like it was all about them and what they wanted to share. So that was really nice too.
Well, thank you. I actually probably, I don't know, 95% of my guests, I have a phone conversation with them before they come on my podcast. Because I want to meet them. I can't some of them I meet in person if they're local, but the majority of them I have not. But I enjoy just having that conversation, even if it's for an hour. Sometimes it's an hour, sometimes it's an hour and a half. It doesn't matter. And I take notes so that I remember when we go into our episode, kind of already their story. So I have a little bit of background because I find sometimes they get nervous. So if I already have some background, then it makes it a little easier for me to kind of ask a question so they don't get that, nervous little, where they don't know what to say or whatever. But it's I've done it a year and I just kind of finally found the process that works for me. That works for me in my podcast and my guests. So everybody does it different, and that is absolutely fine.
Mhm. What is one takeaway that you would like for listeners to get from today's conversation? If someone's listening and they're kind of like resonating with the stuff that we've been sharing, like what is one thing that you want people to take away?
that it's okay to ask for help. And I don't mean that you have to go to
Mhm.
therapy. It's okay to just find a trusted adult or friend and just say, I need help. There's no shame in asking for help. It can be the hardest step you'll ever take, but it'll be the most valuable. That's probably what I would say.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. Is there anything that you're looking forward to with your projects that you're working on right now or your podcast?
I have another speaking engagement next week with American Businesswomen Association. I'll tell my story in front of them. So, again, it's another opportunity to get me out of my comfort zone. And
Mhm.
I want to see how I process afterwards. If I'm growing and becoming more comfortable and not feeling like I want to cry, right? Um, for me, it's just constantly, I just love to meet and talk to people. And I never know who I'm gonna meet, who I'm gonna talk to, where this is gonna take me. I'm going to Podfest, and in that, I just happened to score a free ticket.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, I was so excited. I was so excited. I was like, "Thank you, Lord." So, I don't know where it's gonna take me. I said to my husband from the very beginning, "I don't know where this is gonna take me, but I'm going." And I just think that this is gonna go somewhere big
Mhm.
because I wanna help a lot of people. Just
Mhm.
I want them to have an opportunity to talk. And now that I've been doing it, I've learned to insert music, and now I've just learned to insert commercials. So I have
Oh, cool.
sponsors. Yeah, so I have sponsors, so I can start to kind of monetize, which is really important because this is what I do full time. I'm
Mhm.
completely, able to commit to this. So that's definitely growth some more. And I might start my own meetup group here in the area because there isn't one. So why not, right?
Mhm. That's
Do you
cool.
do you find being a podcaster there's like this podcaster passion that's just like overflowing?
Yeah. Yes. Like it's just exciting. Like I don't know, it's kind of weird to describe, but I get what you're saying for sure. Where can people find you online, or where could people find your podcast?
So my website has literally everything. You'll find all the episodes, pictures, everything. And that's www.ineedblue.net. And blue is the color. So it's INEEDBLUE.net. I am also on all of your favorite podcast platforms. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, you name it, it's there. And I have Facebook and I have Instagram. I Need Blue Podcast as well. I have LinkedIn. So lots of good stuff.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on and just like having this conversation with me. This mini conversation about trauma. I feel like we could talk forever about this topic. But thank you
You're
so much for coming on this podcast.
you're so welcome. I thank you for giving me this opportunity. You're very easy to talk to, and I appreciate you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for watching this video. Remember to hit the like and subscribe button for more mental health videos and tips. And don't forget to visit my website down below.